Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, June 22nd, 2022. And this coming weekend, we're celebrating here at TAC our 16-year anniversary, or commemorating, I guess we could say. And so on this episode, I want to use the words of the Founders and the Old Revolutionaries to tell the story of our plan, our path to liberty, which is the name of the show as well. I'm going to lean primarily on their words exactly without too much of my own commentary, but we'll see how that plays out. I'm going to share the best quotes from people like Jefferson, Dickinson, Adams, Paine, Madison, Mason, Mercy, and more. That was fun. Both Federalist and Anti-Federalist alike, from the times of the Revolution and thought that preceded the American Revolution and the time of ratification and more. But first of all, before getting to that, a quick hello and a huge thank you to everyone joining me here today. I really appreciate you being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Thank you so much. And I should mention that I publish a blog post for every single episode, an individual blog post where you can find all the different platforms we're on. Because if you're watching us on one today and we're gone, we might not be back. And so you'll want to know where else you can find us. We're on a bunch of different video platforms. We also have audio-only podcast edition. You can also find in the show notes section for each episode, I'm going to, especially this one, I'm going to link to all the original source documents. I'm not going to cite them as I go through these today because I've got a lot of quotes I want to get through, but I will link to them in the show notes so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And while we allow people another minute or so to get notifications to join us here on the live stream, I want to say hello to everyone in the live chat. There's Liberty Revolutionary. Good to see you, buddy. It was nice chatting with you again on Twitter last night. Tim Martin, Sheraton Farmer, Clay Kent, Brad Raish. I apologize if I get that name wrong. Missouri Freedom Initiative. Same to you as well. Good to see you. Max Heffern, Sharon, Natural Law, that's a cool screen name. David LeBeau, Haji, Liberty Spike, and everyone else. I appreciate Bonehead88 as well. And Gail Yates. Thank you guys so much for being here. But let's get right to this. And I want to start out with some foundational principles. We're going to talk about the structure of things, how the founders viewed power, then some warnings about what happens to power and things like consolidation, why they created limits, and what to do when government goes beyond those limits. But this isn't going to be easy. As Jefferson put it, getting from, and I'll get to this quote again later, but getting from despotism to liberty isn't going to happen in a feather bed. So let's start out with Samuel Adams, the father of the American Revolution. Here he wrote, this is in 1772. I got to get out of the habit of citing all these as I go through today. Anyway, Samuel Adams. Among the natural rights of the colonists are these. First, a right to life. Secondly, to liberty. Thirdly, to property, together with the right to support and defend them in the best manner they can. So this is in the years leading up to the War for Independence. That's what John Adams called the real American Revolution, the change in the viewpoints, the mindset, the political, religious views of the people from being, I guess, servants to a sovereign king or a king in parliament, but then to people who held their own power and got their rights not as a gift from government, but by their birthright, from nature, from their creator, from God, however you want to put it. That's Samuel Adams, and here's Thomas Paine. Oh, did I just close out Thomas Paine? No, I did not. Okay. He said, it is a perversion of terms to say that a charter gives rights. And those of you who listen to me regularly, you know I rail on the idea of people saying, I've got Second Amendment rights or my constitutional rights are being violated. You don't have constitutional rights. You don't have Second Amendment rights. You just have rights, especially if we're looking at those rights that we're talking about from Samuel Adams, the right to life, right to liberty, to property, the right to support all of those others, and to defend them in the best manner that you can. It is a perversion of term to say that a charter or a constitution gives rights. We have our rights by the very nature of our birth. So the founding generation, instead of looking at power coming from the sovereign king or queen or parliament, They looked at things the other way around. It was flipped on its head during that great revolution in thought. And here's George Mason. He said, all power was originally lodged in and consequently is derived from the people. So government can only do that stuff that the people basically authorize it to do, or when government does stuff it's not authorized to do, it's with the acquiescence of the people. So all power was originally lodged in and consequently is derived from the people. James Wilson, one of the leading Federalist minds during ratification, put it this way: the truth is that in our governments, the supreme, absolute, and uncontrollable power remains in the people. He was discussing a situation where they were talking about sovereignty and delegated and reserved powers. Are you giving powers away? Where did this come from in the first place? And he's saying, like, it doesn't even matter where you look at it or what structure, which constitution, state, or proposed federal, the power had always been with the people and it remains with the people even in this proposed document. That's James Wilson. Here's James Madison, and I think Madison was citing Jefferson in Federalist number 49, and he put it this way: the people are the only legitimate fountain of power. It's the same message, whether it's Mason, Wilson, Madison, Jefferson. Across the board, you see this type of thing over and over and over. Now, unfortunately, the people don't act like it today. But anyways, we know that even when you delegate power to a government, if the people are the source of power, you still have to be aware that government power will always try to grow beyond their just limits. That's how John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, put it. Here's the Federal Farmer, one of the leading anti-federalist writers. In October of 1787, he said, men who govern will, in doubtful cases, construe laws and constitutions most favorably for increasing their own powers. This is one of the reasons why, if you rely on government to put the limits on the powers of itself, you shouldn't be surprised when that power grows and grows and grows, no matter which team is in charge, especially if you only have two. That's just going to keep happening over and over and over. And I'm not getting to Washington's warning, but he warned about this spirit of faction leading to a frightful despotism, back and forth, the spirit of encroachment, the idea that you have one side or the other going after each other, and they just continue enlarging the size and scope of government. It would lead to a permanent despotism. And that's what Federal Farmer on the other end of the spectrum is saying here some years earlier. Washington's farewell was in 1796, and here in 1787, recognizing that people with power will always try to expand that power. It's just something that's always happened. It's the same thing that Abigail Adams said in a letter to John Adams. Power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping. So it's not just kind of an anti-federalist Federal Farmer thing. Abigail and others were more on the Federalist side of things later on, but certainly they all recognize that when government has power, if you let government determine the limit its own power, that power will never stop growing. And that's really the way the people have treated things in our life and for generations. Going to the government in the hopes that the government courts will limit another part of the government or one branch of the other will limit the other. That's really just a population on its knees begging for government to start or stop doing something. That's not how the founding generation told us to do things. I'll get to that in just a moment. So power continually grows. Sometimes it's small. Sometimes it's huge steps. It's not sudden, violent usurpations. Usually, James Madison warned. He told us that it would take years in many situations to get from liberty to despotism. Anyways, here's Patrick Henry in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, talking about how power grows and grows and grows, but this leads to consolidation or centralization of power. Or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. It's kind of a chicken or the egg. Does growing power lead to a consolidation or a centralization of power, or does centralization of power lead to growing power? Maybe it's a little bit of both. I think the end result is that as people want to expand their power in government, that means they're going to be doing more stuff in one area. They're not decentralized. That's not expanding their power. And here's how Patrick Henry put it. He said, dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive. Dangers are to be apprehended. You should always be cautious of what you're allowing your government to do. And he was talking about the proposed constitution, the powers delegated in that document, and he was concerned that it was going to lead to a consolidated government. Maybe we should pay a little bit more attention to some of the warnings of Patrick Henry. He wasn't right all the time. The Federalists weren't right all the time. The Anti-Federalists weren't right all the time. These are flawed human beings, certainly. But on the structure of the power and scope of government, Patrick Henry certainly nailed it in many ways. And today we live under the largest government in the history of the world. So we shouldn't be surprised that when power grows and people rely on government to limit its own power, it's going to keep getting bigger and more consolidated, more centralized over time. And to Patrick Henry, that was the definition of a tyranny, really. That's what they fought a long, bloody war against, was a centralized sovereign authority that could change the rules on a whim, like a living, breathing constitution and the politicians of today. Here's Thomas Jefferson. He said, "What has destroyed liberty?" This is the same view. And he was no fan, especially years later, of Patrick Henry. He said, "What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun?" That's a pretty broad statement right there. In every situation, he said, "the generalizing and concentrating of all cares and powers into one body." So centralization of power was certainly the great threat to liberty. And if you can decentralize, then you're going to have a bad government here and a bad government there. So if we had a federal system here, I don't think California would suddenly be a land of liberty, but I also don't want some kind of libertarian dictator forcing the people of my state who don't love liberty to live free, because that's not how you actually accomplish stuff. You have to lead by example. You have to show people how things are better. And if they choose not to do it, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't. If you force them to do it, all they're going to end up doing, and this is what we see today, and this is a little bit, maybe I should have included Washington's warning, but this is what we see. When you try to force what you think is freedom on people, and maybe you're absolutely right about what freedom is, if they don't actually agree with you voluntarily, you end up with a government of force. And a government of force means they're going to come back and do the same thing to you, and probably in the opposite direction. Many of the Anti-Federalists, Brutus, Cato, and others warned about this type of situation, and so did the Federalists, George Washington and others. Let's look at the next one here. Here's Fisher Ames, another Federalist, very staunch Federalist. He's not a Jeffersonian in any way. In the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, he said, "Too much provision cannot be made against a consolidation." They were so concerned about centralization of power that people like Fisher Ames, who was probably more of a central power lover than most at the time, again, if we're grading on a curve, and I generally don't do that, someone like Ames or James Wilson or even Hamilton are small government people compared to even the so-called best people of today. It's really an embarrassment. Anyways, that's why the founding generation insisted on limits. If a government's going to exist, if they're going to be doing stuff, they have to have strict limits. We know that James Otis Jr. and Samuel Adams, and I covered this in another episode, they said in all free states a constitution is fixed, meaning that if you're going to have rules for government, government doesn't get to change the rules because of political changing, societal needs changing over time. There's a process to make those changes, but the original legal meaning of the document, of the phrases, of the clauses in the document, they stay the same over time. Now, if you don't like it, and the founding generation recognize that there can be changes made, and that's why they included a process to do that. But here's Thomas Jefferson. He said, "I consider the foundation of the Constitution as laid on this ground." So if it was essential to people like Otis and Adams to have a fixed line of power, the government is authorized to only do certain things, then Jefferson, when he's looking at the Constitution, and mind you, this was even before the Bill of Rights was ratified, he's saying this is the basis of the entire document, that all power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. That was 10 months to the day before ratification of the Bill of Rights. That's Thomas Jefferson talking about how you have to have limits, and that's the entire structure and foundation right there. And then going to James Otis, here in 1761, I should actually just mention, this is what John Adams referred to as the beginning of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson considered it consideration of the Stamp Act in 1764 and 1765, but this is 1761. And here's James Otis talking about that fundamental revolution in thought. This is really the beginning of that to Adams, and in many ways, I think he was absolutely correct. Instead of a single person or the king and parliament having sovereignty or final authority, and therefore, even with the unwritten constitution, if they said, well, we're going to interpret that unwritten constitution as meaning this, if they have the final power over the limits of their power, final say over it, then they are supreme. But Otis was pointing out that if you have a constitution, that rises above government. And so government doesn't have the final say of whether it's right or wrong. It really is up to the people. That is why they put the supremacy clause in the Constitution. The supremacy clause says, it's not, I'm not going to do an episode on the supremacy clause. Anyway, so James Otis Jr., an act against the Constitution is void. But it's important for us to understand that acts that are void in theory and in principle are not going to be void in practice by waiving a document at government. It's not, their politicians are not going to stop expanding their own power as long as they can get away with it. They will continue doing that no matter what. They're generally bad people, and even the good people get corrupted. We understand the phrase power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So as soon as people have power, you can look at a guy like John Adams, who, as the Atlas of Independence, was really one of the good guys in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. But then once he got into power, and Mercy Otis Warren talked about this some years later, he became kind of a monarchist. So power absolutely does corrupt. So the notion that we can just tell government, this is supposed to be void, hey, let's go to your courts, and maybe your courts will tell your other branches of government to stop doing that, that's a really bad choice. And I think that's one of the main reasons we live under the largest government in history today. Here's Governor George Clinton of New York. That's the other George Clinton. He said, history does not furnish a single instance, not once. History does not furnish a single instance of a government once established voluntarily yielding up its powers. Now, certainly he was arguing against ratification of the Constitution at that point. He was concerned about, if we give them too much power, it's not like we're going to be able to go back to it and get them to give some of it up. But the same concept goes for when they just start acting and doing stuff, acting outside the limits of the Constitution. And once you establish what the penman of the Revolution, John Dickinson, called the detestable precedent, as soon as they have a precedent to do one thing beyond their limits, they're going to keep expanding it. And they're not going to voluntarily yield their own powers. James Madison even referred, did I jump forward here? First, Patrick Henry. There's my notes being a little bit jumbled. He's actually warning of the same thing. If you're hoping that government is going to do the right thing, if you're going to wave a document in them and say, hey, this shall not be infringed, see, it says it right here, and you just hope that they do the right thing, you shouldn't be surprised when they always do the wrong thing. And that's how he put it. He said, show me that age and country where the rights and liberties of the people were placed on the sole chance of their rulers being good men, without a consequent loss of liberty. He said it happened every time the people made such a mad attempt. I'm paraphrasing that last part, but he certainly said if you're just relying on politicians to follow the rules, to do the right thing, to support liberty, you will always lose that liberty over time. Even if you have some good people doing the right thing for a short period of time, in the long run, and Henry had a long game vision on this type of thing, he certainly warned that you would always lose liberty because he studied history. That's what always happened. The founding generation, the old revolutionaries, they wanted to look at history because they understood that if you could kind of find a similar scenario in a political situation under government and you replicated that, you are probably going to get the same kind of results. So history repeats in that way. So that's Patrick Henry warning against just trusting people to follow the rules. And here's James Madison. This is in Federalist 48. Here, the so-called father of the Constitution is telling us that you can't rely on the Constitution to enforce itself. Here's how he put it. A mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hand. So think of all these things that he's talking about. He's covering a bunch of them just in this one quote at the end of Federalist number 48. He's saying, first of all, constitutions don't enforce themselves. They never have. They never will. And people who expect them to are seriously part of the problem today. That's my ad. So constitutions will never enforce themselves. Literally just putting it on paper will not guarantee that government will do the right thing. And government will always try to expand. So even if you give them limits, they're still going to try to work their way around it. And then the big end problem, the tyranny, the despotism, is a centralization or concentration of power. Here's John Dickinson, who we could call maybe the father of the Articles of Confederation in many ways. Here he is arguing in favor of ratification of the Constitution, pointing out that almost the same thing. Look, you can have the best Constitution possible, but the people in power may just absolutely do all kinds of horrible stuff and ruin it, and vice versa. Here's how he put it. A good Constitution promotes, but not always produces, a good administration. Now, if you have to rely on people to do the right thing, you're always going to be in trouble, but you want to make it as difficult as possible for them to go beyond their limits. It's really, when you get down to it, it's up to the people. And I think, oh, there we go. I got a good one. Here's Mercy Otis Warren. It's up to the people to keep the government within its limits. Because if all power is derived from the people, if the people are the fountain, the source of all power, and government is only authorized to do what has been delegated to it, and if you're not supposed to rely on government to do the right thing, who is left? It's up to the people. And here's Mercy Otis Warren covering that in perfect detail. The origin of all power is in the people, and they have an incontestable right to check the creatures of their own creation. The origin of all power is in the people. And so when government goes beyond its limit, it's up to the people to keep them in check. Here's James Iredell, who became one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court under George Washington. He told us in the North Carolina ratifying convention, hey, usurpation or an exercise of power not authorized to the government. This is a theft of power from the sovereign people of the several states when they do this. He's telling us the way to deal with it, the people will resist if the government usurps powers not delegated to it. So again, it's up to the people to defend their own liberty. Thomas Jefferson put it this way: a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as a gift of their chief magistrate. This is tying in a lot of these things, these concepts together as well. Again, the notion that we are born with our rights. Our rights are natural. They are inherent. They're human rights. They're natural rights. They're gifts from our Creator, from the laws of nature. That's how Thomas Jefferson put it. And if you rely on getting something from government, permission from government, that's not a right. That's a privilege. You're just lucky if they do the right thing. And of course, we don't want to rely on luck because we will always lose our liberty. Again, Thomas Jefferson, a free people claim their rights as derived from the laws of nature and not as the gift of their chief magistrate. Now, at the end of the day, and there's a little bit more here still, it really takes a strong people to defend their own liberty and a well-educated people. Here's how Samuel Adams put it. The truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So it's really a 1-2 punch. You can't just teach people about history. You can't just teach people about strategy and just have them be book smart. They can't just understand, appreciate, and value freedom and liberty. They also have to know how to defend it. And part of that is, again, not relying on government to limit its own power. Samuel Adams, the truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. And as I mentioned at the outset, it's not going to be easy, especially when we're talking about the largest government in history. That's what the Founders and Old Revolutionaries had to deal with at the time of the Revolution. They were also living under the largest government in history. They toiled under that for many, many years, a government that could change its own rules on a whim because they had a living, breathing document or a living, breathing constitution that was not on a document. And that created what they called a despotism. But Jefferson told us that we are not to expect to be translated from despotism to liberty in a feather bed. A lot of people just want to push a button or send a little loot to somebody. Not that I'm going to turn down anybody sending loot over here at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. But a lot of people think that they're just going to sit back and, argue with some people on social media or support one dude versus the other, vice versa, back and forth, or hope that a court case goes their way, complain about stuff, but not do the hard work. And that's how Thomas Paine put it. He said, those who are expect to reap the blessings of freedom must, like men, undergo the fatigues of supporting it. So it's not going to be easy. There is no silver bullet. And if we have expectations that we are going to get from despotism to liberty, from the largest government in the history of the world to a foundational government under the Constitution, you're not going to get it in one fell swoop. And people who promise you a silver bullet, they are all scamming you. They may be ignorant. They may be doing it by accident. They may be grifters. I'm not sure. But as Jefferson put it, he said, the ground of liberty is to be gained by inches. We must be contented to secure what we can get from time to time and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. This is January of 1790, I think the 27th. He's writing to his friend, the Reverend Charles Clay, and he followed that up. I'll paraphrase this. He said, it takes time to convince men what is even good for their own good. So you have to show them by example. That's why a federal system is so important. Because if you have a one-size-fits-all solution for the entire country, when you're learning what's good or bad for you, everyone gets affected. When you can decentralize, and let's say here in California, we disagree with how, well, I don't know who this we is, but let's say I disagree with how someone in Texas does something or how they're running things in Texas or vice versa or South Carolina. It doesn't matter what the states are. The way that you can learn whether or not your way works or fails is to try it out. And the way that is best to do that with the least potential damage is to keep it as close to the individual as possible. Now, some of these states that I'm talking about are absolutely massive, but if Rhode Island tries an approach or Connecticut or somebody, and it's garbage, but it's not a one-size-fits-all garbage, people have a chance to learn more. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, they're all pretty bad now, and I would actually give all states an F when it comes to the Constitution of the state and the federal government. I would give them all an F on liberty. They're all terrible, just in different degrees. And if we don't grade on a curve, I guess, in this type of a situation, like they're all bad, and some of them are worse bad. So no one gets a D. No one passes at all. But that's because there's so many decisions made in Washington, D.C. Everyone looks at everything as a federal issue, and they want the federal courts to come in and force their way on everybody and to protect them, but that's just not working. It just keeps centralizing power in Washington, D.C., and as we see, the founding generation told us that's a pretty bad choice. So Jefferson tells us it's going to take time. It's going to take tireless effort by the people. The ground of liberty is to be gained by inches because we have to convince people what's for their own good, really. We don't want to force them, because that will generate just resistance. And the same in reverse. John Dickinson put it this way in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, the first letter against the hated Townshend Acts in 1767. It's a Latin phrase which I butcher every time, and I was getting better at it, but I think I'm going to get it wrong again. But it's Concordia res parve crescunt. And we actually have that Latin phrase on our membership card. We've had it there for years. For those of you who get annual, 5-year, or lifetime memberships, you get one of these cool, I'm not sure if the focus will come on it, but it's 110% Tenther membership card. And all of these quotes, they really make up some of the foundational principles. Concordia, this phrase means small things grow great by concord. So you start with one small step. You show people the way. Other people will rally to the cause, and then more and more and more, but it's a step by step. The ground of liberty, Jefferson put so many years later, is to be gained by inches, is the exact same thing that the penman of the Revolution put it in the way he put it in 1767. And this really all together makes up, and I hope I did a decent job telling this story through their words, but these make up the foundational principles behind our work here at the 10th Amendment Center. We've been expanding on it over time, and I think we're getting better and better every year. Stuff we work hard every single day to get out to more and more people, but absolutely nothing helps us do that work more than the financial faith and support of our members. I know I already mentioned it a couple of times, but I got to keep doing that. We're celebrating our 16-year anniversary this weekend, so anything you can do to pitch in and support us and help us build a stronger foundation, brick by brick, person by person for the Constitution and Liberty for the next 16 years and the next after that. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Well, there you have it. I mean, 16 years of work condensed into, I don't know, about 30 minutes or so. I hope I did a decent job. I hope it was interesting. I hope it was educational. I know there are a lot of questions probably on this. Well, what about this situation? And a lot more to cover, but hopefully this will hold you over for a few days, because I should mention again, especially if you haven't been listening to every show or if you're new here, I usually do my show every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time, but I'm heading out of town tomorrow for a wedding for my good friend Tom this weekend, so I'm going to be gone. I'm not going to do an episode on Friday. I'm almost certainly not going to be back in time to be able to do an episode on Monday, but either way, whether I do one on Monday evening or Tuesday, I will be back sometime middle of next week, so please do share a link to this episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Feel free to leave comments in the archive or send me emails if you have questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I'm going to take a look over in the comments a little bit later today or tomorrow, maybe on the plane. I'll get a chance to do that as well. And I will reply to as many as possible, but please continue leaving those comments, smash the like button, leave reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. All that stuff will help trigger the algorithm of the platform and tell them to show us to more people. It helps out a great deal. Again, thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first one, you've been here for all 16 years or all 4 years of this show, I can't thank you enough. I'm so grateful for your support in any way that works for you, whether it's financial or just helping spread the word. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.